independent candidate against Chuck Schumer in the 2022 elections. I did have the opportunity to have a brief sort of exchange with him a couple nights ago, which people may be familiar with. But what we're going to take up tonight is something urgently important. Lyndon LaRouche, as his usual prescient self, wrote a paper in 1982 called the Toynbee Factor in British Grand Strategy. And people might say, what's Toynbee? Who's Toynbee? Arnold Toynbee. We're going to get to that. He had a subtitle or alternate title, which was Manipulation of Culture as a Method of Warfare. And in this paper, he discusses at great length, and my colleague Dennis Speed will elaborate this give you much better sense, but the question of culture and the method of thinking. And a great part of the problem that we have today is that there's been an enormous effort to linearize people's thinking, to turn us as if into computers, into binary options only, as opposed to creative thought. Yes or no, up or down, right or left, conservative or liberal. That's not how the universe works, especially an unfolding universe, a growing universe, a living universe. There is a quality of change which is outside of that binary system. And LaRouche in particular identified the question of Shakespeare, having an understanding of Shakespeare and classical drama as being crucial to understanding strategy. And I'll give one simple example, which is on everybody's mind right now because it's all over the press, which is the situation in Afghanistan. And even putting it that way, in Afghanistan, is a fallacy because Afghanistan is surrounded by, I actually haven't counted the number of nations sharing borders directly, but I know it's at least China, Pakistan, Iran, I think is sort of on the other side, but in the region, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, I have to get my map out and look at it. It's many nations in a region which is sort of the central area, the crossroads of the world, which may be one of the reasons why the British wanted to keep it so destabilized. It's been a cockpit of war for the last 40 years, and that's not how it always had been. It's part of a region that had a very advanced culture, a region that was known as the land of 1,000 cities, a place where apparently, as if people heard John Segerson on my symposium a few weeks ago, you had many kinds of people exiled there. You had entire Greek colonies and Greek sculpture in this region. You had advanced underground irrigation systems and aquifers, which were extremely advanced for their time. So this is not what people think of as just some kind of disaster area on impossible terrain where everybody is crazy. So it was a ground of a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union back in the 80s. And then after 9/11 occurred, Lyndon LaRouche brilliantly said, I hope no one blames this on Osama bin Laden, because there's no way that some guy with kidney failure sitting in a cave could have pulled off the magnitude of what occurred on those attacks. And LaRouche also said, I hope that President Bush gets in touch with Putin. Now, happily, Putin called Bush and let him know that the Russians were standing down various air defense systems, thank God. So we avoided a potential hair trigger for a nuclear or wider war. But how did LaRouche, first of all, have any idea to say these things on the morning of 9/11? How was it that as early as January 3rd, 2001, he was warning that the Ashcroft nomination meant an intention by the incoming Bush administration, which wasn't even clear if they had won the election or not won the election. It was an election very much like the one we just had in certain regards. So he had no clear mandate. So he wanted, LaRouche warned, there'll be a pretext for a Reichstag fire event to rule by decree. 9 months later, you have 9/11 and what's done in the wake of it. We have to have mass surveillance. We have to have nudie photos when you go through the security at the airport. We have to be able to spy on everybody. Why? Because otherwise the terrorists are going to get us. So don't ask any questions. This is how we do things. And we've had this form of crisis management since then. Well, now you have a situation where President Trump negotiated a deal with the Taliban, among others, to get our troops out of there. Biden followed through on something that I heard Trump myself describe as an irreversible process when he was taking credit for getting our troops out of there. Now he's saying it's a complete disaster. But nonetheless, it's occurring. We are ending this war. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in the tradition of her late husband, comes seemingly out of the blue and says, this is a great opportunity. This presents an opportunity, she said, perhaps not exactly comparable to the Berlin Wall coming down, but an opportunity, but it is somewhat comparable where we can end the regime of perpetual war. We can end the era of regime change wars. We can launch a new kind of relationship among nations that is not based on geopolitics, and that the United States could work with China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, all the nations in the region to create a stable and prosperous nation of Afghanistan, which would change everything. Now, when I talk to people about this, they say, well, I don't trust China. Oh, I don't trust Russia. Why do I? Well, it doesn't have to do with that. This is not pairwise interaction between the US and China or Russia, although personally, I think there are good reasons to trust China and Russia if you look at what they've done lately. But nonetheless, suppose you don't trust them. Then I ask, well, do you think that China, having gone through what it went through with the Uyghur terrorists, many of whom entered the country through Afghanistan or were trained in Afghanistan, can afford or wants to have drug-addicted terrorists flooding across its borders? Do you think Russia wants that? Do you think Pakistan, do you think, and finally, this particular person relented and had a different idea of why there might be a potential. And what I'm saying is not even the actual level of the potential that's there, but I'm just using it as an example for how people have become limited in their ability to think. So before I introduce my friend, Bill Ferguson, who's going to have something to say about this in a special project that he's working on with one of our late, very dear collaborators, Fred Wills, who was an expert in Shakespeare and who was the former foreign minister of Guyana and who was an expert, having studied at King's College in England. And I just read on Wikipedia, I didn't know this, that he had actually been made a member of the Queen's Council. So he was considered, he knew the British very well. But here from this paper from LaRouche, he said, we must see such matters as the unfolding of a process. We must see that process as if it were a drama unfolding to our observation on a stage. And we, for a moment here, reading this report, are directing our consciousness to see our own consciousness elaborated on that stage. As the tragedy of the drama manifests itself to us, we must sense the wish that the self we see on stage might avoid the tragedy by the obvious means. No, we in the audience wish to cry out to ourselves on that stage. Don't you see to what you are leading yourself? At first, it is our impulse to shout out to the character on the stage, don't do it, please don't do that. Then we become more anguished, and without one color of sacrilegious oath-making, we wish to cry out, for God's sake, stop doing that before it is too late. Then our frenzy sinks into a moment of depression. We cannot stop the drama from unfolding so. The script has been written. Fate cannot be altered in this matter. Can this not be altered? Can the tragedy be turned? Why could we not change the consciousness of that character ourselves on that stage? Of course, it could be changed. Whence our depression then? We reached a moment in which we passionately desire to change the ordering of our own processes of conscious judgment. At that precise moment, we lost the power to act. We lacked precisely in that moment the quality of strategic command, which Clausewitz on war attempts to circumscribe with the German term Entschlossenheit. Even seeing our own consciousness as a character apart from ourselves, we could not bring ourselves to change what we recognized as our own consciousness. That is the tragedy of the characters on the stage. That is the tragedy in real life. So I'm going to stop there and let Bill Ferguson up in Massachusetts tell you what he's working on and why, and we'll go from there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, indeed.
Great. So my wife, Clarette, and I have been working on this project for several months, and hopefully by September, we'll be able to establish a page on the Schiller Institute website entitled Shakespeare in Exile. And it is a page making accessible audio recordings and transcriptions of lectures that Fred Wills gave on the plays of Shakespeare. These lectures were given in the New Jersey, New York area beginning in late 1986. As Diane said, Fred was the foreign minister of Guyana. He also served as the justice minister of Guyana and was educated at King's College in London. So he had very distinguished credentials as an attorney and as a scholar of history of Shakespeare and in physical science. Now, the lectures were given to an audience of political organizers, activists, supporters of the LaRouche movement, and especially the Schiller Institute, of which Fred was a board member. And so he had a lot of academic and professional distinctions, but I would like to emphasize that his crucial qualification for helping to educate organizers in statecraft was the fact that he took common cause with Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche to work to implement LaRouche's ideas for a new just economic order. In 1976, at the UN General Assembly, he gave a speech where he called for an international debt moratorium for the developing sector and the establishment of a system of international development institutions to finance economic development in the developing nations, or as they were known then, the third world. And this calls to mind something that Fred used to always repeat. When he began these lectures, he was about 58 years old. And he used to say, in my country, I'm an old man, and because the life expectancy was very low in Guyana, a country of population less than 1 million people in the northern part of South America. But he took the courageous step of putting this forward in front of this international body, to put LaRouche's program front and center at the United Nations. Now, soon after that, he found himself in exile from his own country, based in the northern New Jersey area. And I remember him saying it wasn't so much that he wanted to go back to Guyana, it was just that he couldn't. And so he devoted himself to educating and developing the capabilities of the organizers in that area. He gave lectures at the U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania. He also taught at Rutgers University. But I think the center of his activity at that time was working as a professor in what LaRouche used to call a combat university on wheels for the organizers in his movement. So, so this, like I said, this was 1986 that these lectures began, and that was a interesting period because it was very soon. It may even have been the week after the Great Leesburg raid, where the FBI and other federal institutions worked to shut down and ultimately set up to perhaps assassinate Mr. LaRouche. That was in 1986. So it was a very important time to strengthen the resolve and capabilities of our organizers. Now, I just want to give you some of the basic ideas that informed the presentations that he gave. First of all, he emphasized that it would be a mistake to approach a play from the standpoint of narration. In other words, just read the play, follow the action. He said that you can't understand what's happening in the play and the purpose of the play unless you study the universal history behind both the events depicted in the play and the context in which the play was written. So your study of Shakespeare's dramas has to include the study of universal history. And he also emphasized that the subject of the plays wasn't the story. Shakespeare's audience was highly literate, and they knew the story. If they didn't know it because of its historical background in the culture, then there was advanced publicity to make sure that the story was known as the audience came in. The subject of the play, like I said, it wasn't the narrative. The subject of the play was the process of thinking, both of the characters depicted, but as Diane illustrated with that quote, much more the thought processes of the audience, to cause the audience to reflect on the method of thinking, their own method of thinking, as it was reflected in the method of thinking of the characters in the play. So the characters thinking and the culture that they came from, the culture that's depicted. This is the subject, and the ability to reflect on that self-consciously, and the ability to reflect on the state of one's own thought processes. In the first lecture that we're going to have available was on King Lear, and he kept coming back to what he referred to as Platonic questions. The first Platonic question he emphasized is, why are things as they are and not otherwise? Which is coherent with the concept, Leibniz's concept of necessary and sufficient reason. Why are things as they are, not otherwise? There must be a reason. There must be a cause. Things don't just happen in an orderly universe. Second, the second Platonic question was, what assumptions have I made? What assumptions am I making that I'm not aware of? What assumptions that could cause error or catastrophe? And these are the fundamental questions that should be guiding one's reflection on the policies that one supports and the action one takes amongst in the realm of policy, in the realm of politics, et cetera, and how we interact with one another. And the questions of, so fundamentally, these are strategic studies of statecraft. And he emphasized again and again that what is the basis of statecraft? You always have to ask yourself, and this applies in every in every aspect of political life as well as personal life. What am I? Is what I am doing? Is what I am doing? What I'm thinking? What I'm advocating? Is this consistent with a principle of natural law? One of the questions that is really focused on in King Lear is, should law be based on custom? You know, we've always done things this way, and we're going to continue to do it because since we've done it that way and it's worked, let's leave it that way. Or should law, governance of nations, should it be based on a principle of natural law? And the fundamental principle of natural law, as Fred emphasized, is, and Lynn, of course, is the fundamental distinction between man and beast. The quality of creativity, the quality of the unique quality of the human being to change his behavior, change his axioms, to examine what he believes about how the universe works, and challenge it and change it to perfect his knowledge, to increase his power over nature. These are the fundamental questions of statecraft. And this is what you have to ask yourself when you're examining any kind of policy. Is it consistent with the principles of natural law? And we can go into some details perhaps later in the Q&A, but this is what Fred called on us to do, is to view these plays as strategic studies, as putting the thought processes of kings and dukes, et cetera, but not just them, but citizens, to cause them to think, how are we making our judgments? Are our judgments going to get us to the future that we want to create? And of course, in the case of a classical tragedy, the decisions and judgments that are made and acted upon in the course of the play lead to disaster. And the most important point about the disaster is that it didn't have to happen. It could have been avoided with the right thinking. So if the protagonists or the problems of the culture that's depicted, if they were addressed, the tragedy, the disaster could have been avoided. So I'll just end my remarks here by saying that given the current situation, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, then all the journey of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current while it serves, or lose our ventures.
Thank you very much. So as I referenced in the title about cancel culture, we have actually been victimized by cancel culture over many generations. LaRouche had stressed that one of the reasons why people have a hard time thinking is because Shakespeare is taught so badly, if at all, in the schools, and people completely misunderstand it. They don't know what irony is. They don't know what metaphor is. And you have people who think that we should ban such things from discussion. And I was just reminded of Fred Will's very Shakespearean sense of humor when he described parents of the other students coming to King's College and seeing him as a young man there from Guyana and saying to him, "Tell us, do they have toilet paper in your country?" And Fred responding, "Oh no, we use crushed glass." It's very typical of dealing with these people. So Dennis Speed, who is the coordinator of LaRouche's Manhattan Project, a longtime collaborator of myself and Bill Ferguson, has some things to say, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to pick up right from where Bill discussed some things, because what he said at the end in particular about this being a tide in the affairs of men which taken at the flood leads on to fortune is the situation in Afghanistan. The situation in Afghanistan is the best situation that has existed there in 20 years. The reason for that is because there are forces that the United States has on the ground, particularly in certain of the areas, that are capable of, in collaboration with China and other nations, creating the conditions for the advancement of economic changes in that area, which were otherwise impossible so long as the military occupation was the character of the American deployment. This is important to understand. For example, why was everybody so confused that nobody fought? Here's the reason they didn't fight. The Americans were an occupying force in a place that has been conquered never. It wasn't conquered by the Mongol Empire, by the Persian Empire, by the British Empire, by Alexander the Great, by Tamerlane of the Scythian Empire. It never got conquered. And the people there are, as they say, fiercely independent. Matter of fact, we used to call them fiercely independent. The fiercely independent Afghan freedom fighters who are our allies, who are not simply the people that identify with the United States. No, they are the exact people that we presently today call the Taliban. What's also interesting, however, is that, as was noted by President Biden, Taliban is not killing anybody so far as he knows. Matter of fact, they're trying to be extremely, extremely careful and cooperative. There are reasons for that, which the American mind could understand were it to reflect on the lessons of Martin Luther King. But nobody wants to understand Martin Luther King. Actually, Martin Luther King is one of the most detested figures in American history. And it's proven whenever applying his methods as he wished it applied to foreign policy comes up. Let's remember that Martin Luther King became controversial in the United States because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. And because his idea was that you have to apply the principles of creative, nonviolent, direct action to foreign policy. You'll never hear anybody invoke. Matter of fact, Barack Obama specifically, when he received his Nobel Prize, opposed Martin Luther King on precisely that point. So it's useful to think about what kind of tragedy has actually engulfed the United States. Again, here we'll reference Linda LaRouche and what he had to say. In the Toynbee Factor, there's a paragraph where he said, when the proper acquaintance with Shakespeare was ripped out of our school's curricula, what our nation lost was persons adequately developed to become future citizens of this republic. That's right. As he says, without Shakespeare, John Milton, and Percy Shelley in our secondary schools, those schools will produce chiefly eternally adolescent functional illiterates. Eternally adolescent functional illiterates, or worse. This importance is not because of the fame of those authors as such, but because these works written by them represent a distillation of those aspects of our English-speaking culture by means of which true citizens are produced. Everybody's aware that we speak something called the English language. You ever think about the fact that you never really know what the origins of that language are? There's a presumption that there's simply an English language. Well, there was something called Chaucerian English. There was something called Middle English before that. There was something called Shakespearean English after that. And each one of these is a different English. In fact, if you give people a text written in the English of the 14th century, they can't read it. Matter of fact, they can barely read the text of William Shakespeare. They say, oh, that's just because it's old. No, actually, it's because you don't know the language that you're caused to speak, which you did not invent. And what's important about thinking about this is that the policies that you have been caused to support, you also didn't invent. Yet you talk about it and converse as though you understand what you're actually led to believe. And that's exactly what we have to look at in this case of Afghanistan. What's important, again, I repeat, is that the situation in Afghanistan is the best situation it has been in 20 years. But knowing how to actually realize that is something that would only be available to those who have an understanding of two factors. One, history, ancient history in particular, and also have an idea of British intelligence. So that's why we're going to talk about Arnold Toynbee. Can I have the first graphic? Arnold Toynbee was born in 1889 and he died in 1975. It's important to think about that because he died in October of 1975, some months after the United States made its ignominious exit from Vietnam, another disastrous war that we entered into not because of American interests, but because of interests related to the French and British empires in the 1950s. Next. Lyndon LaRouche, in his book, The Toynbee Factor in British Grand Strategy, as I've just alluded to it, spent a whole set of several pages to discuss this factor of British intelligence and its use of history. Next. The policy that the United States has been involved with, really, certainly since 1979, in the case of Afghanistan, is called the Clash of Civilizations policy. This is a book by Samuel P. Huntington, who was a very close associate of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the two of them were sort of the architects of what you call or refer to as the war on Islam or the war of civilization against Islam, etc. And this is a cover of his book. Next. This is the book, The Grand Chessboard, which is American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. Zbigniew Brzezinski is the person who in 1998 was interviewed and stated at that time that he had policies during the summer of 1979 of making sure that the Soviet Union then was given a problem on its wormy underside. That is to say, Afghanistan. And in those areas which were at that point under the Soviet Union, such as Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, those were all Soviet socialist republics. But the way that Brzezinski looked at them is that they were areas in which Orthodox Islam or other forms of Islam were actually very vibrant, and they were natural opposition to Russia. There's a reason that he thought that, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. Next. The name, the Grand Chessboard, by the way, is a takeoff on the British designation for this area called The Great Game. And we'll talk about this. This is a Time magazine that discusses what's called the crescent of crisis, troubles beyond Iran. That's next. And here is a a slide. I'm not able to read it apparently for a minute. I'll try. An arc of crisis stretches along the shores of the Indian Ocean with fragile social and political structures in a region of vital importance to us, threatened with fragmentation. Resulting political chaos, I guess, could well be filled by elements hostile to our values and sympathetic to our adversaries. So the arc of crisis, or the crescent of crisis. So that was a way of invoking the idea of mad Islam, and mad Islam being the enemy of the Christian West. Now, that's not what it was emphasized, but that was exactly what it was. Next. So this is a map in which we show what's called Huntington's civilizational divides. I just want you to note that the area, which is the former Soviet Union, and all of the republics I happen to mention, there's others involved, is referred to as Orthodox. Then you see Northern Africa and what people call the Middle East or Southwest Asia as Islamic. Okay, so Orthodox refers to the Russian Orthodox Church. Then you see the area Hindu and so on. So these areas are not mapped by Huntington according to geographic borders. Those aren't respected. That was not what our policy was directed toward from 1979. Now notice, of course, you will think of the wars having started in 2001, but it didn't. It started with Brzezinski under the Carter administration, in which he provoked through Afghanistan, going to the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, the jihad, what he called the jihad. And the notion was a jihad against the godless communists of the Soviet Union, and to invoke the spirit of Islam in order to defeat the godless communists. That came from our State Department, our national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. That was not something that came from some radical Islam that was pre-existent and was prepared to somehow fight the Russians. We created that. Next. This speaks for itself from 1990, The Roots of Muslim Rage by Bernard Lewis. Now we go to who Bernard Lewis is. Let's go. And you see the eyes of the mad Muslim who has America in his crosshairs. Next. This is a picture of the Ayatollah Khomeini being escorted back into power in Iran by various members of the military. It was the United States, together with the French, because Khomeini was in Paris, who placed Khomeini back in Iran to take power in Iran. Yes, the United States, which had occupied Iran from 1953 when it made a coup against the democratically elected leader of Iran at that time, Mossadegh, and installed the Shah of Iran, who ruled for 26 years and was replaced by a series of governments. But the Ayatollah Khomeini, the very sort of the cynosure, the avatar of mad Islam, was placed there by us. Next. This is simply a map which shows what's called the Bernard Lewis plan for the Middle East. So who's Bernard Lewis? Well, Bernard Lewis was a British intelligence agent that actually originated the plan that Zbigniew Brzezinski called the Arc of Crisis, which Zbigniew Brzezinski plagiarized from Bernard Lewis, who just recently died, by the way. He died at the age of 101, was here at Princeton University for a long time. And then Samuel Huntington's Arc of Clash of Civilizations was a plagiarism of Brzezinski, who had plagiarized Bernard Lewis. No, the Americans did not have an original policy. The policy was taken from British intelligence, which, by the way, had mapped literally every family in Afghanistan going back generations because of the earlier dominance by the British who in Afghanistan. The British were defeated in Afghanistan and retreated from that area. But they were the ones that had the cultural background to identify for the United States before it did go in. Every family in that area. Next. This is his book, Faith and Power. Lewis has a reputation as the great Arabist of Western civilization, that he supposedly knew the Arab mind better than anyone. And I want to get at something here and now to get us to Arnold Toynbee. because he's really, Bernard Lewis, that is the descendant of a much longer process in the British Foreign Office, a process that Fred Wills understood very well. Let's go to next. This is a map which is not from Samuel Huntington and is not from Bernard Lewis and is not from Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is a map from Halford Mackinder, which talks or identifies a very important idea just to have about why the United States has actually left Afghanistan, but is going to be deploying in the Indo-Pacific and other areas unless we change that policy for something different. This is the world island, and you see Asia there in the center, and it's called the pivot area. You see this thing called the lands of the outer or insular crescents. Okay, that's on the outside at the bottom of your screen. Then you come up here to what's called the crescents, and you see the pivot area. So these notions that you're seeing in Brzezinski or Huntington are old. This is from the turn of about the 1900s. Okay, next. So not Arnold Toynbee. As I mentioned, he was born in 1889, and he died in 1975. He comes from a long line of historians and others. Next. And this is the cover of his book, War and Civilization. And it's part of his 12-volume, it says 6 volumes there, but this is an old slide, a study of history or outline of history. And this is something that was very popular in the United States. If you grew up in the period of the 1960s and 70s, if you looked on the back of your Sunday newspaper, you already saw Arnold Toynbee's study of history. If you read that, you were supposed to be a truly cultured person. And I believe that we have a short video of Toynbee talking about his views of religion. And I'd like us to play that if we have that at this point, and then we just come to some concluding remarks.
Just a quick second.
When I started writing this book, I was still in this unreligious and slightly anti-religious state of mind. As I went on, not merely writing but living, I came to think again that religion was the important thing in life.
Now, you've also said that only a revival in religion can save Western civilization. Why do you say that?
Because I've come again to believe that it's religion that gives meaning and purpose to life. And after all, without purpose or meaning, what is human life? What can human beings do?
What kind of religious revival do you have in mind?
A very undogmatic one that would perhaps distress some of the orthodox in all the religions of the world. The essence, to my mind, of religion is a belief that there is something above and beyond ourselves, some spiritual presence in the universe, which we must get in touch with and wish to get in touch with, and which can help us and guide us.
Now, isn't there something to be said against a religious revival, which may possibly lead to fanaticism and violence? Because isn't it true that some of the bloodiest wars in history have been religious wars?
It's been the tragedy, I won't say of all religions, but of the Western group, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They have been exclusive-minded and therefore fanatical. And if the revival of religion in these Western religions meant the return to fanaticism, that would be an almost prohibitive price to pay, I agree.
Now, Mr. Toynbee, are you a Christian yourself?
Orthodox Christians will not admit that I am, will not agree that I am, because on some of the most elementary points of the creed I should not pass muster. But I have, of course, been brought up in a Christian atmosphere and background, and my emotional relation to Christianity is bound to be different to that, my relation to other religions which I know intellectually but haven't lived inside.
Well, let me press you a little on this. Do you, for instance, believe in the virgin birth and the miracle? Wouldn't it be really true to say that you're just a humanist who has got vague supernatural ideas, which I suppose most of us have?
Well, no, not just a humanist. I'm on the other side of the line as compared to a humanist, because I do believe in this presence beyond human beings, beyond man. Now, a humanist thinks that the universe is just confined to mankind. We're the highest thing in it. This is the crucial distinction, I think.
Mr. Toynbee, has religion been an inspiration and a comfort to you in your own life and work? And if it has, in what way?
Well, it certainly has, because after all, like everybody else who goes through life, I've had troubles, griefs, sorrows, and in those things, religion has been a very present help in time of trouble. Also, it's something that gives meaning and purpose to life. I think without religion, life would be rather a bad joke. With religion, it does seem to lead somewhere.
Okay, so I want people to note something. He says that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are problematic because they are exclusivists. So what kind of religion is he talking about? The thing that should be kept in mind is that the majority of the existence of human civilization, people have been religious, but they have not been monotheistic. And neither is Mr. Toynbee. And what we're looking at here, and this is the issue of the narrative, is that if you try to look at what is going on in terms of the present circumstance, not in Afghanistan, but just in terms of American foreign policy from a non-religious standpoint, you'll miss the fact that you're dealing with Christians who are not Christians, Jews who are not Jews, Muslims who are not Muslims. And British intelligence has deployed on the basis of that for a very long time. From the time of particularly Aleister Crowley, this became very evident. Of course, he referred to himself as the great Satan, but it's not just Satanism, because even Satan is a minor figure in the religious world of the pagan. We're talking about the Babylonian world, and the Babylonian world is the world of the Iraq, Mesopotamia, the production of gods. That is what British intelligence is about. That's what's going on here. And what we're looking at in terms of their approach versus an American approach is, if the American approach is taken that we've outlined, and we will be talking about again tomorrow, of economic cooperation, trade, and development, with a reinforcement of the role of the United States by means of using what, for example, Franklin Roosevelt and others advocated, then what will happen is that you'll get a stabilization. If we don't do that, then what you're going to get is a form of religious war that you won't even recognize, but you will be able to do nothing about. And this is exactly the thing that we also see happening domestically in the United States right now. That's what you see around things like climate change, which is a religious suicide movement. It's a cult. And you're seeing the reorganization of these. So it's important that people take a look at and think about this idea of classical meaning, in this case, post-Greek Platonic societies battle to establish the idea of a universal principle of human creativity, a universal principle of reason, which is the basis upon which the trial of Socrates executed Socrates for his defense of precisely that principle of a single unified conception of creativity that was later expressed in Christianity and have been also expressed in Judaism and Islam. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm sure people listening are still trying to figure out what's so off about what Toynbee said, though you're getting at it, but exactly, really, thank you. So Marcel Lutece, who is a high school English teacher and has been teaching Shakespeare in the schools for some time, I think probably has some insights from what's been said so far. So Marcel, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. Since the topic that has been broached recently is that of this sudden debate over whether Shakespeare should be taught in schools, I'd just like to begin by saying that when someone who is ostensibly familiar with Shakespeare questions why he is being taught in the schools, what are they really asking? Or put another way, what intention is being expressed when composers such as Shakespeare have long been recognized to inspire, provoke, beautify, and enlighten us towards higher levels of humanity in the most reflective and profound manner? And I would start by saying, just take the study of Hamlet and what it illustrates about the universal and timeless lessons of leadership, moral courage in a crisis, and how we mediate these crucial tests of character based on our self-conception and understanding of our human identity. When King Hamlet's ghost, really Hamlet's conscience, tells his son to avenge me, is he instructing Hamlet to be bloody or be nothing worth, or something entirely different? When Hamlet reflects, to be or not to be, what consummate, exclusively human choice is he contemplating, and yet which he has already decided against? And how do we know this? In the graveyard scene, why does Hamlet characterize Caesar and Alexander the Great as nothing more than dirt to stop a hole in a wall? And is he right about this? Can we live on after our corporeal selves terminate? How does this cautionary play characterize the human failure responsible for most tragic events throughout recorded human history? Consider the implications of achieving immortality and controlling our own destiny as a species, developed and examined with 16 to 18-year-olds. How do we learn from the tragedy so that we do not fail when called upon to be most human? Or think about Macbeth, where Shakespeare projects and personifies corrupted ambition onto the stage as the three witches, endowing them with the precise character to demonstrate the delusional and lawfully destructive power of corrupting evil when we allow and enable it to consume us. Consider these qualities as the Greek tragic cycle of arete, hubris, ate, and then nemesis, as this plays itself out. All of these being examined and understood, developed by 14 to 16-year-olds. Or the quote by the foolish King Duncan of Scotland, when he asserts that, quote, "There's no art to find the mind's construction in the face," expressing in Aristotelian fashion that he believes all you can know is that which is perceived by your senses. With any classical work, the demonstrated solution later in the play, that there is an art to find the mind's construction in the face, is poetically and sonorously accomplished in Act 4, Scene 3, creating the punctum saliens, hence the turning point of the tragedy, akin to the resolution in a classical concert, a classical piece of work. Imagine developing these concepts and principles with 14 to 18-year-olds in conjunction with Plato's allegory of the cave, Machiavelli's The Prince, and selected Edgar Allan Poe short stories. Now, with these brief examples from Shakespeare as representative of infinite others composing his works, consider what kinds of citizens and what kinds of societies for time immemorial would be developed through generations of youth being immersed in this type of classical beauty. We do not have to imagine, however, since the works of Shakespeare and others of his intention and skill were responsible for the American victory over oligarchy and the wise, elevated minds who built our yet still enduring republic. Because the inspiring and liberating nature of these timeless, universal, and beautifully human ideas has posed a threat to the tyranny and ultimate subjugation of humanity, which the oligarchical powers so desire, many tactics have been routinely displayed, primarily through the colleges and universities which train the teachers. This is accomplished by either attempting to deny the existence of classical humanism outright, or to disfigure and malign the works to the point where they are made to become entirely unrecognizable. Some of the common tactics which have been viewed, learned from these colleges, learned from these supposed training grounds for the optimistic future of teaching, include the pre-existing and naturally occurring cynicism and pessimism within a stagnant and futureless society, labeling beautiful ideas as mere whims or romantic fantasies, hopeful wishes, if only we could do this or that, when it is inherently possible. Students are discouraged from thinking about human optimism too seriously. Don't go there, don't bother with it, the teachers say. You'll only be disappointed. The denial of truth and universal principles has been a constant throughout this battle. Everything is arbitrary, and meaning is only to be found within oneself based on a person's own private senses and feelings. If anyone tries to tell you that universal truth exists, you should fear that person. There are also certain tactics such as literary deconstruction, exposing and hyperanalyzing contradictions and oppositions within a work to arrive at a fabricated, synthetic meaning which bears no resemblance at all to the intention of the writer and completely disables the power of irony and metaphor. Literary lenses, or interpreting a work through a single, narrow, and often irrelevant focus. Imagine trying to learn Romeo and Juliet from a feminist lens or a feminist perspective. Or imagine trying to understand and make sense of The Merchant of Venice from a Marxist lens. And these are the kinds of things that are deployed. There's also the personal, experiential, superficial reflections masqueraded as legitimate examination and analysis. In other words, a certain scene in a play will be read, translated, sometimes in the books you're given, into modern conventional English, and then you're told, well, look at the conflict this character faces. I want you to go home and write an essay about a similar conflict that you faced in your life. What were you feeling? What were you thinking about? And what are the similarities between your situation and the situation of this character? And that constitutes having learned a scene from William Shakespeare. There's also many more, including the limiting factor of exclusively student-driven group work, where only the students and any pre-existing knowledge or observations accounts for the learning that takes place. Now, from these reflections and from my teaching experience over the years and others I've spoken with, it's clear to me that a Shakespeare work is never the cause of student negativity or boredom, only the way it has been taught or the way in which it can or has been characterized in advance. The students will react lawfully to a Shakespearean work as long as the matter is developed competently. Even if a student does not fully grasp the ideas, there is so much to compel them that they will sense a beauty, a harmony, a power intended to be beneficial for them. At the introduction to a play, many students will groan and bemoan that, Shakespeare is boring, or I don't understand the language, and etc. This is why it may be good to do some sonnets in advance, certain bite-sized, non-intimidating, very brief examples of Shakespeare's genius and Shakespeare's power. Most of the negative expressions, their perceptions of the work, are cleared away when we do a primer on what the nature of classical humanism is. Predisposed emotion is replaced with curiosity, as many students have never heard themselves described or characterized as human beings described in such elevated and beautiful terms. In most cases, this welcomed affirmation of their potential and their curiosity to know more intensifies and then transitions as the work is commenced, and they begin to see the ideas they are interested in developed. Many respond with a greater respect based on the way they perceive the composer to be addressing their minds seriously and beautifully, which is something very useful for them, but is rarely done, or much less than it should be, in today's culture and society. Finally, there arrives a point where students are able to confidently express a certain, albeit tenuous, but a very creative, a very inspiring ownership of the ideas and a happiness that they have done so. Some students even respond with gratitude toward Shakespeare. He is amazing. Or, wow, he did this for us, even from 400 years ago. And that is truly amazing. Over my experiences, it is clear that student reactions fully validate the beauty and power, universality and timelessness of the work of Shakespeare and his kindred composers of that caliber. So to conclude, I would say that forbidding the teaching of Shakespeare or any classical work in the schools is an overt act of racism. This action would deny every ethnicity, comprising the one and only race, being the human race, access to the pursuit of beauty, to sovereign cognitive development, and to the exclusively human potential to achieve immortality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcel. That's wonderful. And caused me to think of something which you, I know, are familiar with, which is an experience that some of my associates had in teaching music, when a teacher thought, well, if we really want the young people to be engaged, we have to take things from quote unquote their culture. That's what they're going to be interested in. They're not going to be interested in Bach. It's too difficult, or Beethoven. Let's take something with a beat. Let's take it. And in fact, the students had all kinds of discipline problems and were not that interested. But when they had an opportunity to actually sink their teeth into Bach, instead were completely transformed and attentive. And in that regard, you're seeing the magnitude of the crime, because what you're talking about is a crime being carried out against the younger generation, which is depriving them of a certain joy of being human, and also depriving them of the ability to act in a moment of crisis or in a moment of opportunity, which Bill was getting at. So there is one question which I think we can just weave into the discussion, because this discussion is not divorced from reality. A person asks, what do you think of the doomsday clock? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which warns us how close we are to nuclear war, and I'm not sure how close it says we are right now, but we are quite close. So I'm going to stop there, but Bill, I thought you might have some thoughts, or Dennis, whoever, we can just open it up.
Oh, yeah, I can say something about that. Bill, you want to start? Because otherwise I'll.
No, I need to.
Yeah,
think
there's a piece from Maureen Dowd, which is in the New York Times from July 24th, called Apocalypse Right Now. And what it does is it talks about how right now, you know, the climate change problem has basically overwhelmed the capabilities of mankind and really probably reached the point where nothing we do can really stop it. Anyway, her article elicited 1,700 responses, but then within that, people who responded also got responses. So here's a lady named Sophia who got 1,900 responses to what she had to say. And here's what she said. She said, I have one child, a daughter, who told me at age 8 that she would never have a child because of global warming. She's now 34 and has never changed her mind. So I will not experience a grandchild. For her wisdom, I am grateful. I would be heartsick if I did have a grandchild who would have to experience the onset of changing climate. So then there's a series of responses to her. Read a couple of those. Sophia, I completely agree. I have 6 grandchildren and weep inside for the calamitous life that is ahead for them. You don't have to be Nostradamus or Rachel Carson to read the handwriting on the wall. We have been judged and found wanting. Okay. Here's another one. I weep with you, Sophia. All these people like to weepers. Whenever I look at my 11-year-old daughter in the eyes, I feel so many emotions. Guilt for bringing her into this dying world. Hope her generation will be able to overcome the challenges. And above all, fierce love. Blah, 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 blah. It goes on like that. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that. Now, so you have a Malthusian problem. You had a Malthusian problem in this country, and it's very deep. It's deeper than people have been allowed to think. And these people would support mass population reduction for global warming, certainly in the places where people are having the most kids. And that would be, you guessed it, Africa. So what's happened is that the liberals have been evolved to the point that they now are ready, under what Fred Wills used to call the doctrine of regrettable necessity, to advocate subtly the extermination of hundreds of millions of people, which they will do, but they will feel proud and justified as they step up to the challenge of global warming. So when talking about the doomsday clock, that's my response. I think the issue involved, again, is these are people who are hoodwinked by a narrative, probably don't know how to read a Shakespeare play, or read it in the way in which was described by Marcel in the misteaching, miseducation that's gone on in the schools that he described.
Bill, were you going to say something?
Well, it reminds me of some of what Fred Wills took up in these discussions, in these lectures. In the Lear lecture, he's very kind when he refers to the environmentalists as not thinking through the consequences of the policies that they advocate. And because it's a violation of natural law. I mean, it also is clear that like the people that Dennis is describing, they must not have any conception of what a mission for a nation or even for an individual life would be. And he also, in the course of the lecture, is attacking he attacks cultish religious beliefs and the cultish belief in what is represented as science, false theories of causation that are represented as science. Like he says in the section where he's focusing on why are things as they are and not otherwise. He says, why does an apple fall from the tree? Because the apple is attracted to the earth? He said, that's a stupid answer. It's a good question, but it's a stupid answer. And then I'm also reminded of what Dennis is describing reminds me of the modern version of the Aristotelian syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, we should kill him.
Oh my. Well, we have some more questions. One from YouTube for Marcel, I think would be best. Asks, why do you think Shakespeare is taught wrong in schools and universities? And how do their methods fail? Which I think you addressed a bit in part, but they seem to want elaboration compared to your methods. Or maybe they're asking, how would you teach Shakespeare?
Well, I think that in looking at Shakespeare, and I know this sounds like, a very simplified answer, but I think when you see it taught properly, you feel a certain power. You see that there is a certain full sense of a crux behind it that is going to change the way that you identify with what it means to be human, with ideas that it takes time to figure out. It takes time to develop. However, it's something that when you see it done on stage, and then when you read it over, what you realize is that all of Shakespeare's works have in fact been characterized as some of the greatest works ever recorded, that they have been preserved in the highest places for generations. I mean, think about these things from a perspective where you're saying, I don't know, I wouldn't say read, he would recite Shakespeare to his cabinet to get them to think about some of the most difficult, some of the most challenging problems. And Lincoln, of course, was the leader of the United States when it was challenged more than at almost any other time in its history, with the exception of possibly right now. Shakespeare was taught at one time in the United States in every secondary school system. So that's something I think to start with, to just ask yourself, well, why in fact is, and I know this is just saying, well, how can so many people be wrong about it? But let's take another more specific example that I had gone into earlier about Shakespeare's to be or not to be speech. Now, the average, even the average scholar on the street, to be or not to be, that is the question. Do I live or do I die? In fact, do I commit suicide right now because I can't stand the tragedy of this kingdom? I'm personally angry. I'm enraged because of the evil of my uncle. So I think I should just kill myself. However, if you look at the next couple of lines that precede that, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. And only when he talks about those two potential actions, and he cannot stand to do either because he's in complete terror and complete paralysis, then he goes on to the discussion of the undiscovered country. And he cannot even sort of laughably, he can't even dare to do that because he doesn't know what's on the other side and you can't come back. So when you look at the context and you see how simplified that first line is, then you begin to realize that this is something of a much higher gravity. And if in fact to be or not to be means true existence, then it begs the question, well, is there a way to exist beyond merely from the time you're born to the time you die? And if so, what is that? And then that completely changes the face of the entire play. And it gives it a power and a potency and a timelessness and a beauty in terms of the verisimilitude of universal lawfulness that cannot possibly be ignored. So, I mean, this stuff does take work. It took me a lot of plays over and over again. And every time I would review it or read scenes over, I would find something new and something different and something more profound. But I would say, I think that's a solid example to start with. You really need to investigate these things. And you'll definitely be considerably better for it. And so will, I think, the people around you if you share it with them. Thank you.
Great. I think in that regard, also, if you get back to this binary, yes, no, up, we tend very much to want to simplify things to what you could call pairwise interactions. Bill was getting at that. Why does the apple fall from the tree? Well, I did this because so-and-so said that. I did this because that happened. He's going to do that if you say this, or I don't understand why he did X. And what you get to experience when you're working through the unfolding of a drama is the complexity of the relationships, not only of the characters to each other, but up to the society of which they are a part, the culture that they are embedded in, which either they act to change it or they don't. And it's very similar to a classical composition in music, where people tend to say, well, it's just the particular interval between these two notes. But your mind doesn't experience a composition as a relationship between two pitches. Your mind already creates inside of itself a key, a sort of a center of gravity. So even if you only heard one pitch, you would already, only hearing that, not if that was the first one, you have to have at least three, I think, notes at the beginning to establish, but it gets, the composer establishes this, and then you could hear one note by itself, and you would have a sense of whether it was stable or unstable. I like that term better than consonant or dissonant, stable or unstable, because your mind has already created a geometry in which these things are unfolding, and they have complex relationships amongst themselves. And that's how the mind works. That's how the universe works. It's not one thing. The planet Earth is not only in a relationship with the sun, it's in a relationship with the moon, it's in a relationship with the galaxy, it's affected by, not yet, we're not advanced enough to be changing the climate, but I wish we would change the climate and figure out how to stop things like earthquakes or, hurricanes or tornadoes or things like that. I guess that's weather, not climate. But these things are very complex. And that's the wonderful excitement about it, because we haven't learned everything. And that's, I think, one of the other really rotten things that it's done to children is, we've already learned everything. There's nothing new to discover. The universe, we've discovered everything there is. So forget it. What you see is what you get. The earth is ending. And, you might as well give up. And it's too bad that you had children. Which is a terrible view and not true.
Diane, if I may just add one thing quickly, just in an exemplary sense, since I have the feeling that maybe this caller, might need that. I would also ask, or the person who's, communicating in, have you, how many Shakespeare plays have you seen performed? Or how much time have you spent looking over sonnets or reading through the major plays and looking for something that's not literal? So that would be one thing. And also, to use the example that Diane, I think, just very eloquently talked about in Hamlet. So although the focus might be on Hamlet's personal angst, is there a way he can stop his personal suffering in a comfortable way? Can he make peace with leaving things the way they are and hoping for the best, or committing suicide, or whatever it is that might make him comfortable, which lawfully is nothing actually? You begin to see that this is on a completely different magnitude. It's not about him and his happiness or his comfort. It's about the idea of existence. Recall that at the end of the play, Denmark, an entire country, tens or hundreds of thousands of people cease to exist. Just like that. Well, they still continue to exist, but the country of Denmark ceases to exist. And in today's world, we apply the same principles, and we're talking about, if a nuclear holocaust should occur, potentially the Earth and the human race ceasing to exist or continuing to exist fruitfully and multiply, depending on what we learn from a great play like that of Hamlet. So I would just add that. Thank you very much.
Bill or Dennis, any thoughts?
I think that Hamlet is applicable to right now. I think you are living in a country which no longer remembers that the 200th anniversary of its founding is not only upon us, it's technically already begun as of 2020, and not seen by people, but people who wouldn't know anything about American history would understand why I'm saying that. Go start with the Boston Massacre. And that the ancestors of the nation cry out to us at the top of the battlements of the castle and say, avenge us. And whether you're talking about Alexander Hamilton or Benjamin Banneker, whether you're talking about George Washington or Frederick Douglass, whether you're talking about the Mather family, Ben Franklin, or you're talking about people like Robert Smalls, the congressman, or others. The truth of the matter is that this existence of these people and what they did, while it should be in the forefront of the mind, it's not what's in the forefront. The forefront of the mind is, well, I've got to take responsibility for saving a planet whose laws I don't understand. And I have to do that by invoking something which I also never studied, but I believe I have the right to pronounce upon, to the point that you have people, saying things like this. Frankly, as someone who has been concerned about climate change and observing what is happening over the last 10 years with real dread, I do not understand why anyone in the last 10 years would voluntarily have a child. So for those who thought that the Chinese one-child policy was bad, guess what? You've got plenty of Americans that want to propose a no-child policy because of something called climate change. That's called child sacrifice, something that went on all of the time in paganism. So I think that the Hamlet study would be something very much in order. And I'd also just to say in terms of the issue of Shakespeare, the sonnets are 14 lines. A week has 7 days. If you manage to simply memorize a couplet a day, you can memorize a sonnet in a week. Why is that important? Well, go look at them, and maybe you'll find something that's important in them. And maybe that itself would change your relationship to the idea of culture, because you're not getting it in a classroom. You're getting it because it's something that's important for you to know and to identify with. That's when you have a real population which has a real sense of culture. And that may be the fastest way to try to reintegrate some people into citizenship in our nation.
Thanks. Bill, I think we're going to wrap up soon, but do you have anything you want to say?
Well, from fairest creatures, we desire increase.
I'm sorry.
That's
I think
wonderful.
that's the solution.
That's great. And that leads to what I wanted to conclude actually with the question I got by text from someone who's asking about China, the fact that they have ended their one-child policy. They now want people to have 3 children, and I think even more. And there's some anxiety among people about having an economy to support them, and they are going to help with the education. And the person who writes in says, now that the Chinese have a 3 children policy or more for families and help with educating them, do you think they will out-educate us with the truth? Well, in a way, I'm afraid they had a conscious decision after the Cultural Revolution to shift where they were. So not only did they create the conditions where 850 million people could get out of total grinding poverty, but there is an optimism in the nation because of the potential of what it's possible to do, and that people have seen their standard of living changing and improving within their lifetime. So they also have millions of classical musicians. And in fact, Xi Jinping announced, I believe, 10% of their budget is going to be spent on culture. Now that also includes sports and recreation, but it includes the creation of character, of people who have a sense of what is beauty, that beauty is not arbitrary. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. There are certain principles, which is why young people would be attracted to Bach as opposed to something else. Young people doing the work would be thrilled to learn Shakespeare as opposed to some trashy novel that you pick up at an airport. And I think that's what we have to give people to be able to solve this. So in closing, I just wanted to let people know that Dennis will be moderating a conference of the Schiller Institute, which I'll also be involved in tomorrow, which starts at 12 noon Eastern time. It's at schillerinstitute.com. You can find this on exactly this question of Afghanistan. We had a forum July 31st, I believe it was, where this was taken up, and it was rather amazing because each of the speakers had a slightly different perspective, and some of them were really diametrically opposed in terms of the potential. Could it work? Was there, virtually everyone at this point has to have concluded there is not a military solution, although everyone who spoke that time, I don't think was even convinced there wasn't a military solution. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche did was able to, she said, there has to be a new idea. There has to be an idea on a higher plane that allows us to address this. And wouldn't that idea be this global health system that is a health platform? Because what's required to do that? Running water, electricity. If you have 10% of the population addicted to heroin, you need medical centers. You have a pandemic ongoing. It's a way of kind of jumping over a lot of the disagreements, creating something which is universal for human beings, and then you move from there. But you don't try to impose a political agreement before you move on the economic potential, before you create the condition. How can you get a political agreement when people are addicted to drugs or starving or, you know, under other conditions? So I think this discussion tomorrow now comes in a completely different situation. So that's at noon. I would urge everybody to watch it. I also would like to say that we just have, and I'm sorry I don't have here to hold it up, but the third issue of my newspaper, The New Federalist, has just come off the press. It's absolutely fantastic, I have to say. It's great. And we need people to help distribute these, particularly all over the state of New York. This is the way I'm organizing my campaign, is through this newspaper, because we can't rely on the social media, especially since they can shut us off or remove us at any moment, and it's not the best venue for profound thought. So I'd like to thank all of you, Marcel, Bill, Dennis, for being part of this discussion tonight. We'll have more, and I hope everybody who's listening can tune in tomorrow at 12. So thanks very much, and we'll see everyone next week.